The sharp, cold glow of the server rack light was the only thing illuminating the back office when I unlocked the door at 5 o'clock in the morning. The rest of the shop floor was completely dark, save for the emergency exit signs casting long, red shadows across the concrete. I stood there for a moment, letting the heavy steel door click shut behind me. The air in the building was thick and familiar. It smelled of hot machine oil, raw aluminum, and the faint, acrid scent of industrial cutting fluid that always lingered from the night shift. It was a smell I had known for 30 years. It was the smell of my entire adult life. In my right hand, I held a solid steel micrometer. The metal was smooth, worn down by decades of friction against my thumb. It was the first precision tool I ever bought when I opened Ward Precision Aerospace. Back then, it was just me, a single manual lathe, and a bank loan that kept me awake most nights. Over the years, I had built this place from a drafty garage operation into a military-grade component manufacturing facility. We machined aerospace parts with tolerances down to a fraction of a millimeter. We built the components that kept commercial airliners in the sky and military jets in the air. It was quiet, exacting, unforgiving work. And for the last 5 years, my son Donald had been sitting in the office right next to mine, acting as our lead design programmer. I had always believed that shared blood meant shared values. I had made the sacrifices every parent makes, assuming they were building a foundation for the next generation. I missed his little league games because I was pulling double shifts on the floor to make payroll. I drove a beat-up truck for 15 years so I could afford to buy him the high-end computers he wanted for college. I wanted him to have the formal engineering education I never had. I wanted him to take my analog world and bring it into the digital age. I gave him the keys to my kingdom, completely trusting that he understood the weight of what we had built. That was my blind spot. I had spent my life measuring physical objects with absolute, unyielding accuracy, but I had refused to measure the character of my own son. I walked over to the main administrative desk and set the micrometer down. I like hard copies of our daily operational data, so every morning at 5, the system automatically prints out the server maintenance and network traffic logs from the previous 24 hours. It is usually just a stack of routine diagnostics. I picked up the thick stack of paper and began flipping through it, taking a sip from a thermos of black coffee. My eyes stopped on page 4. The coffee in my mouth suddenly tasted like ash. I placed the cup down slowly, staring at a massive block of text on the printed log. It was a data packet transfer. A massive one. Gigabytes of proprietary computer-aided design files had been bundled, compressed, and exported to an external, unrecognized IP address. I checked the timestamp, 3:42 in the morning. I looked at the specific file directories that had been copied. It was a slice of the patent-pending schematics for our brand-new aerospace tool line, enough to show me exactly what he was reaching for. 3 years of research and development. Millions of dollars in future revenue, the absolute core of our company's future, and he had just proven he could move it out into the dark without tripping a single alarm. But the detail that made the air freeze in my lungs wasn't the size of the file or the destination. It was the origin point. The internal log clearly showed the exact workstation that had initiated the transfer. It was the terminal sitting exactly 40 feet away from me, behind a locked glass door. It was Donald's terminal. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the low, steady hum of the server cooling fans. I didn't panic. I didn't shout. I stood perfectly still, letting my mind try to find a reasonable explanation. That is the emotional margin a parent gives a child. I told myself that maybe he was just backing up the system remotely. Maybe he was working late from home and needed to run a stress simulation on the new files. I wanted to believe there was a logical, innocent reason why my lead programmer was downloading the lifeblood of our company in the dead of night. But I knew better. Standing there in the cold blue light of the server rack, holding the paper in my hand, my eyes drifted out through the office window toward the glass-walled conference table on the mezzanine above the shop floor. The memory of yesterday afternoon clicked into place like a machined steel part locking into a housing. It had been 3 o'clock. The afternoon sun had been glaring through the skylights, reflecting sharply off Donald's brand-new, leased luxury sedan parked aggressively close to the loading bay doors. He always parked there, right in the way of the supply trucks, a silent signal to the floor workers that his convenience mattered more than their logistics. I had been sitting at that glass table, a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hand, looking at a glossy, 100-page presentation deck Donald had dropped in front of me. "They are offering a multiple that we will never see again, Dad," Donald had said. He was pacing the length of the conference room, smoothing the lapels of his tailored suit. "This is an international manufacturing conglomerate. They have unlimited capital. This is the exit strategy." I had looked down at the slick corporate logo on the cover of the binder. Donald had been quietly courting this offshore buyer behind my back for months. He had compiled a comprehensive buyout package, offering to sell them the exclusive proprietary rights to our new aerospace tool line. He wanted to hand over the intellectual property and walk away with a massive executive payout. "We have 85 people down on that floor," I had said, my voice calm, pointing out the window to the machinists working below. 85 people who rely on this shop to feed their families and pay their mortgages. If we sell the intellectual property to an offshore buyer, they won't keep production here. They'll gut the manufacturing side, lay off our people, and produce the parts overseas for a fraction of the cost. The answer is no. Donald had stopped pacing. He looked at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, condescending frustration. "You are living in the past," he had sneered, leaning over the glass table. "You are romanticizing blue-collar struggle, because it's the only thing you understand. The market doesn't care about your loyalty to a bunch of replaceable machinists. I am not going to spend the next 20 years of my life chained to this dusty shop floor just so you can feel like a benevolent patriarch." "You don't have to stay, Donald," I had replied evenly. "If you want to leave and join a corporate firm, I won't stop you, but I am not selling the company to fund your lifestyle." He had stared at me for a long, silent moment. The mask of the frustrated sun melted away, replaced by something cold and entirely transactional. He picked up his glossy presentation deck and tucked it under his arm. "This company is going to scale, Dad," he had said, his voice dropping to a low, measured register. "The industry is moving forward, and we are going to move with it, one way or another." He had turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind him. Snapping back to the present, I looked down at the physical server log, still resting in my hands. The timestamp glared up at me. 3:42 in the morning. He hadn't just been angry. He hadn't just been venting his frustration. He had been delivering a veiled threat, and then he had walked straight to his computer and put a contingency plan in motion. He was bypassing my authority entirely. He was stealing the schematics to sell them to the offshore buyer himself. By 9 o'clock that morning, the shop floor was fully awake. The building vibrated with the deep, rhythmic, bone-rattling hum of 20 heavy CNC machines cutting through aerospace-grade aluminum blocks. The smell of hot metal shavings and lubricant filled the air. It was a loud, chaotic, beautiful symphony of American manufacturing. I walked out of my office and onto the floor. I needed to see him. I needed to look my son in the eye. I needed to read his body language and figure out if I was dealing with an arrogant kid who had made a stupid, impulsive mistake in the middle of the night, or if I was dealing with an active corporate spy. I moved down the central aisle, nodding to my machinists as I passed. As I approached the glassed-in office belonging to Mike, my floor supervisor of 20 years, I saw Donald standing inside. The door to Mike's office was propped open a few inches. I stopped behind a tall pallet of raw aluminum stock, completely out of sight, intending to wait until they were finished before stepping in. But the loud hum of the shop floor was just quiet enough in this corner for me to hear Donald's voice. He wasn't shouting. He was speaking in a quiet, deliberate, deeply sympathetic tone. It was a tone I had never heard him use. "I know it's hard to watch, Mike," Donald was saying. "But you've noticed it too, right? Over the last few months." I held my breath, leaning slightly closer to the gap in the door. "Notice what?" Mike asked, his gruff voice laced with confusion. "His memory," Donald said, sighing heavily. It sounded so practiced, so perfectly rehearsed. "He's losing a step. He's forgetting conversations we've had. He's misplacing vendor contracts. I didn't want to say anything to the crew, but the doctors are looking into early-onset cognitive issues." A cold, heavy stone dropped into the bottom of my stomach. "Tom?" Mike asked, sounding genuinely shocked. "I was just talking to him yesterday. He seemed perfectly sharp to me, Don." "He has good days and bad days," Donald replied smoothly, layering on the false sorrow. "But he is resisting the reality of it. He's becoming paranoid, irrational. That argument we had yesterday about the international expansion. He completely forgot the financial projections we agreed on last week. I am just trying to prepare a quiet administrative transition so the company doesn't suffer when his memory completely goes. I need you to keep a close eye on him, Mike, for his own safety." I stood frozen behind the aluminum pallet. The deafening roar of the heavy machinery all around me seemed to fade into total, absolute silence. It wasn't just financial theft. It was character assassination. Donald wasn't just downloading proprietary files in the middle of the night to broker a backroom deal. He was actively, systematically planting seeds of doubt among my most loyal employees. He was building a narrative. He was laying the psychological groundwork to declare me legally incompetent, framing his eventual hostile takeover not as a betrayal, but as a tragic necessity executed by a loving son saving his father's company. He was using my age, and the trust I had built with my crew, as a weapon to erase me. In that moment, standing in the shadows of my own factory, the last remaining thread of my parental leniency snapped. The quiet pain of a father realizing his son is broken washed over me, heavy and suffocating. But it only lasted for a few seconds, because almost immediately the grief was burned away by a cold, clinical, absolute resolve. I stayed behind the pallet, throwing the door open, demanding an explanation. That was what a man does once he's already lost control of the room. I just turned around and walked silently back down the aisle toward my office. The man standing in that supervisor's room was no longer my son. He was a hostile corporate entity wearing my son's face. And if he wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate espionage and psychological warfare, he was about to learn a very painful lesson. He was about to learn why you never, under any circumstances, bet against a man whose entire life has been built on exposing flaws down to a fraction of a millimeter. I walked back into my office, locked the door, and picked up my phone. It was time to bring in outside professionals. Marcus was the kind of man who didn't ask questions when you called him at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and asked him to clear his schedule for the night. We had known each other since the early days of the company, back when he was a young network engineer wiring my first CNC machines to a central server, and I was a machinist trying to figure out how to pay him. Over the years, he had built a quiet, highly lucrative career as an independent cybersecurity contractor for defense firms. He knew how to build digital fortresses, and more importantly, he knew how to quietly dismantle them. He pulled his nondescript gray sedan into the back lot of the shop at midnight. The floor was completely empty, the heavy machinery powered down, leaving only the smell of cutting fluid and the faint hum of the overhead ventilation running on its lowest setting. I let him in through the loading bay doors. We didn't exchange pleasantries. I handed him a thermos of black coffee, and we walked silently up the steel stairs to the mezzanine offices. When we reached the server room, I unlocked the glass door and stepped aside. "I need to know everything that leaves this building," I said, keeping my voice low even though we were the only two people in a 50,000 square foot facility. "And I need to know exactly whose fingers are on the keyboard when it happens. But the network has to look completely untouched." Marcus didn't ask who we were investigating. He just nodded, set his coffee on a side table, and opened his laptop. He connected a heavy braided cable directly into the primary server switch. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the rapid, rhythmic tapping of his keyboard and the soft whir of the server cooling fans. I stood by the window, looking out over the dark shop floor, watching the moonlight catch the polished steel of the lathes below. "He's good," Marcus finally said, his voice a quiet rumble in the small room. He didn't look away from his screen. "Whoever set up this export protocol knew exactly what they were doing. They bypassed your primary firewall by tunneling the data through a background diagnostic port. It's designed to look like routine system maintenance to any automated security scan." "Can you track where it's going?" I asked. "I already have," Marcus replied, tapping his screen. "It's routing through a proxy server in Geneva, but the final destination IP belongs to a corporate holding group based out of Shenzhen. They specialize in international aerospace acquisitions, and they have very deep pockets." The confirmation settled into my chest like a block of lead. Donald wasn't just entertaining offers. He was actively funneling our proprietary architecture directly to a foreign competitor. "I am installing a silent keystroke logger at the root level," Marcus continued, his fingers flying across the keys again. "It operates beneath the operating system. It will record every single keystroke, every mouse click, every deleted draft, and every encrypted message sent from the terminal in the next office. It bundles the data into microscopic packets and routes them directly to a secure, offline drive I'm leaving with you. The user will never see a spike in processing power. They will never know they are being watched." He finished the installation, disconnected his laptop, and handed me a small, heavy black drive, no larger than a deck of cards. "Every time you plug this into your home computer, you will see exactly what was typed on that terminal," Marcus said, his eyes finally meeting mine. There was a quiet sympathy in his expression, He knew exactly whose terminal we were monitoring. "You're building a paper trail, Tom. Make sure you get everything." For the next 3 days, my life became an exercise in absolute ironclad discipline. I arrived at the shop at my usual time. I walked the floor, inspected the raw aluminum stock, and drank my coffee from the same ceramic mug I had used for a decade. And I interacted with my son. That was the hardest part. The emotional toll of looking into the face of a man you raised, knowing he was actively engineering your destruction, is something that cannot be adequately described. It requires a total suspension of your own humanity. I had to build a wall between the father who remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle and the chief executive who was managing a hostile corporate spy. Donald played his part beautifully. He was attentive. He was polite. He walked into my office on Wednesday afternoon with a printed invoice, his brow furrowed in an expression of perfect, manufactured concern. "Hey, Dad," he said, keeping his voice gentle, almost patronizing. "I was just looking over the tooling orders for next month. Did you forget to authorize the carbide shipments from the Ohio vendor? The deadline was yesterday." I looked at the invoice. I hadn't forgotten the shipment. I had intentionally delayed it because the vendor was renegotiating their bulk pricing, a fact I had clearly explained in our Monday morning production meeting. Donald knew this. He was testing the waters. He was testing the narrative he had planted with the floor supervisor. He wanted to see if I would second-guess my own memory. I looked up at him, keeping my expression perfectly blank. I let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds. I let him feel the weight of my gaze. "I held the authorization pending the new pricing tier, Donald," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Just like we discussed on Monday. You can go ahead and authorize it now. The new rates are in the system." He blinked, a brief flash of irritation breaking through his mask of concern before he smoothed it over. "Right, of course," he said, backing out of the office. "My mistake, I must have missed that detail. Make sure you write it down next time," I said quietly, turning my attention back to my monitors. That night, sitting in the quiet of my home study, I plugged Marcus's black drive into my personal computer. The screen flooded with lines of text, a complete, unfiltered transcript of Donald's digital life over the last 48 hours. I spent hours reading through it, cataloging the betrayal stroke by stroke. I found the encrypted emails confirming the technical specifications of our new tool line to the Shenzhen buyer. I found the offshore bank routing numbers where his executive retainer was being held. But the document that finally killed the last lingering ounce of parental grief was a drafted email sitting in his hidden-out box. It was addressed to a high-powered corporate litigation firm in the city. The subject line read, "Confidential inquiry regarding medical incompetence and emergency power of attorney." I sat in my dark study, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses, and read the email my son had written about me. He detailed a fabricated history of my declining mental state. He listed dates and times where I had supposedly forgotten critical business contracts, citing the delayed Ohio vendor shipment as his most recent proof. He outlined a strategy to ambush me with an emergency injunction, using sworn affidavits from manipulated employees to freeze my control of the company assets pending a mandatory medical evaluation. He was explicitly asking the lawyers to draft the paperwork required to strip me of my life's work, under the guise of protecting me from my own failing mind. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion. Anger makes you reckless. What I felt was entirely different. It was a cold, pure, clinical clarity. Donald had given me the exact blueprints to his own execution. I printed the email, the routing numbers, and the encrypted data logs, placing them into a thick manila legal folder. I was building the paper fortress, but the paperwork wasn't enough. If I simply fired him or confronted him with the logs, he would deny the context. He would claim the emails were hypothetical business models. He would claim the medical inquiry was a genuine concern born of love. I needed him to commit an act so irrefutably criminal, so undeniably devastating, that no lawyer on earth could spin it into a misunderstanding. I needed him to steal the files, and I needed the offshore buyer to receive them. But I could not let them have my actual intellectual property. On Friday night, I waited until the second shift clocked out. By 11 o'clock, the building was completely deserted. I walked into the engineering department, bypassing the main servers entirely, and sat down at the primary air-gapped drafting terminal. This was the machine where the true master CAD files for the new aerospace components were stored before being uploaded to the network for daily work. I inserted a military-grade, encrypted physical drive into the terminal. Slowly, meticulously, I dragged the master blueprints, 3 years of research, stress testing, and proprietary geometric coding onto the drive. I verified the transfer, then permanently scrubbed the master files from the terminal's hard drive. The real company was now sitting in my shirt pocket. Then I turned my attention to the network server. The files Donald was preparing to steal were still sitting in their usual directory. They were the honeypot. In aerospace manufacturing, the margin between a perfect component and a catastrophic failure is invisible to the naked eye. We machine turbine housings and pressure valves that operate under thousands of pounds of force. The integrity of the metal relies on complex, mathematically perfect geometries. If a load-bearing strut is altered by 0.02 of an inch, the part will look identical on a computer screen. It will look identical sitting on a workbench. But when you put it inside a high-stress environment, the microscopic flaw creates a harmonic vibration. And within seconds, the metal will simply tear itself apart. I opened the primary CAD files on the server. Deleting them or corrupting the data so it wouldn't open would tip him off immediately. Instead, I went into the core geometric architecture of the 5 most critical components. I systematically altered the stress tolerances. I shaved a fraction of a millimeter off the internal bracing parameters. I adjusted the thermal expansion coefficients, just enough to guarantee structural failure under standard operating heat. I changed the digital checksums so the modifications would register as an authorized optimization update, completely masking the sabotage from any standard software review. If Donald stole these files, he would be stealing a beautifully designed bomb. When the Shenzhen Holding Company received these schematics, their engineers would review them and find nothing wrong. They would authorize the manufacturing of the prototypes. They would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars tooling their own machines to cut the metal. And when they finally placed those stolen designs onto their testing stands and spun them up to operational speed, the parts would instantly, violently shatter. Donald's reputation with his deep-pocketed offshore buyers wouldn't just be damaged. It would be utterly, irreversibly destroyed. He would be exposed as a fraud who had sold them defective, dangerous blueprints. I spent 4 hours rewriting the tolerances, double-checking every mathematical equation to ensure the sabotage was perfectly concealed. When I was finished, I saved the altered files back into the primary directory, exactly where Donald expected them to be. I closed out of the system, leaving the background diagnostic port wide open. I wanted him to walk through the door. I wanted him to feel the thrill of the theft. I stood up, stretched my back, and walked out of the server room. The red exit signs cast long shadows across the dark shop floor. I locked the administrative doors behind me, walked out into the cool night air, and got into my truck. The trap was set. The paper fortress was built. Now all I had to do was wait for my son to pull the trigger. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the screen of my home computer flared to life, breaking the pitch-black silence of my study. I was sitting in my leather armchair, a cold cup of coffee resting on the coaster beside me. I hadn't been asleep. When you know a thief has the keys to your house, you do not close your eyes. You sit in the dark and you wait for the lock to turn. The silent keystroke logger Marcus had installed was functioning flawlessly. It was transmitting a live, encrypted feed directly from the server room at the shop to my personal network. On my monitor, a small black command window opened. I watched, in real time, as the remote access protocol was initiated. User ID, D. Ward. Location, remote IP proxy. Action, directory access. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk. My breathing was slow and measured. Over the next 45 minutes, I watched my son navigate through the company's secure architecture. He moved with the practiced speed of someone who had rehearsed this exact theft 100 times in his head. He bypassed the secondary administrative warnings. He opened the primary engineering directory, and then he highlighted the honeypot files, the 5 critical aerospace schematics I had meticulously sabotaged just hours earlier. A progress bar appeared on my screen, mirroring the one on his remote terminal. 4.2 gigabytes of proprietary data, 3 years of my life, millions of dollars in future revenue. It took less than 3 minutes to compress the files into an encrypted folder. When the transfer was complete, the command window showed a new application opening. It was his hidden, secure email client. I watched the keystrokes appear on my screen letter by letter as he typed the message to the corporate holding group in Shenzhen. The architecture is attached. Engineering specs and stress test data included. Package delivered. I expect the final escrow release to be authorized by Monday morning. He hit send. He wiped his remote login history, completely unaware that the logger was operating beneath the operating system, permanently recording every single action. He logged off. The screen on my end went dark, returning my study to shadows. I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of my computer tower. There was no anger left in me. The betrayal was no longer an abstract fear or a painful suspicion. It was a documented, irrefutable fact. It was a digital fingerprint that could never be erased. He had crossed the line from a frustrated, ambitious son into a federal criminal. On Monday morning, I did not go to the shop. Instead, I drove downtown. The financial district of the city was a canyon of glass and steel, a place where fortunes were legally dismantled and redistributed every single day. I parked my truck in an underground garage and took the elevator to the 42nd floor. Sarah Jenkins was a senior partner in corporate litigation. Her office smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and lemon polish. There were no decorative plants, no framed motivational posters, and no comfortable couches. It was a room designed entirely for the surgical application of the law. Sarah sat behind a heavy oak desk, reviewing the thick manila folder I had just placed in front of her. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and a demeanor that completely stripped away any social pretense. She didn't offer me a sympathetic smile when I sat down. She didn't tell me she was sorry about my family situation. That was exactly why I had hired her. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp turn of paper as she read through the contents of Marcus's offline drive. She reviewed the keystroke logs, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the encrypted emails to the Shenzhen holding company. When she finally reached the printed copy of Donald's drafted email, the one outlining his strategy to declare me medically incompetent to force an emergency power of attorney, she stopped. She read the page twice. Slowly, she closed the folder and folded her hands on top of it. "I have seen executives do terrible things to each other in this city, Tom," Sarah said, her voice a calm, even register. "But weaponizing a fabricated dementia diagnosis to seize a parent's life work, that requires a specific kind of malice." "I am not interested in his malice," I replied, keeping my voice just as level. "I am interested in his liability." Sarah nodded, a faint, dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. "His liability is absolute. By transferring proprietary, patent-pending aerospace designs to an unauthorized foreign entity, he has violated the Economic Espionage Act of 1996. He has crossed state and international lines with stolen intellectual property. This is no longer a standard civil dispute over a family business, Tom. This is a federal crime." "And the domestic buyout?" I asked. "The multiple he was trying to force me to take?" "Based on the emails you intercepted, he is planning to use the medical incompetence angle to remove you as the primary shareholder, forcing the board to approve the domestic buyout to save the company," Sarah explained. She tapped the folder. "He wants his golden parachute. He wants the luxury payout. We are going to let him try." I looked at her, letting the silence ask the question. "We do not strike yet," Sarah continued, leaning back in her chair. "If we fire him today, he will claim the offshore emails were a misunderstanding. He will hire a defense firm to drag this out in civil court for years. We need to wait for the physical evidence of his fraud to materialize. The foreign buyers are going to test those files you altered. When they do, and when they realize what he sold them, they are going to come after him. We let the pressure from his own illegal actions crack him first. When he is backed into a corner and tries to execute his hostile takeover here, that is when we drop the hammer." She pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and uncapped a silver fountain pen. "I am going to draft the civil injunctions to freeze every single asset he possesses," she said, her tone shifting to pure operational business. "Every bank account, every stock portfolio, every piece of property. But more importantly, I am turning this forensic dossier over to a contact I have at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Corporate Espionage Division. We coordinate our timing with theirs." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my jacket. "How long?" "In aerospace manufacturing," Sarah asked, looking up. "Tooling the machines for new prototype takes at least 2 weeks. We wait. You go back to your shop. You look your son in the eye every morning, and you do not give him a single reason to believe you know anything. Can you do that?" "I have spent 30 years measuring metal down to the thousandth of an inch, Sarah," I said quietly. "I know how to hold a steady line." For the next 17 days, I lived inside a ghost town of my own making. I arrived at the shop at 5 in the morning. I drank my coffee. I walked the floor, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thud of the CNC machines cutting aluminum. And I watched my son celebrate a victory he hadn't actually won. Donald's arrogance swelled to fill the space around him. He believed he had successfully stolen the company's future. He believed his offshore escrow account was about to clear. He started arriving at the shop late, walking past the floor machinists without acknowledging them, a smug, untouchable smile fixed on his face. He even had a new, high-end espresso machine delivered directly to his glass-walled office, a small, visible monument to his anticipated wealth. He continued to lay the groundwork for his medical narrative. In production meetings, he would intentionally misquote figures we had discussed, looking at me with manufactured concern when I corrected him. He would subtly ask the floor supervisor if I seemed tired or confused. I absorbed every single insult. I let him build his false reality, knowing perfectly well that the foundation beneath it was rigged to collapse. The collapse happened on a Thursday afternoon. It was 2:15 p.m. The shop floor was loud, the afternoon shift running at full capacity. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a stack of vendor invoices, while the hidden command window from Marcus's logger ran silently in the bottom corner of my secondary monitor. Suddenly, a massive spike in encrypted network traffic registered on the logger. It wasn't an outbound transfer. It was a barrage of incoming, high-priority messages hitting Donald's terminal from the proxy server in Shenzhen. I clicked the window, expanding the live feed of his screen. The offshore buyer was not communicating through formal legal channels. They were furious and they were panicked. The messages flooded his inbox, flagged in red. Subject, fatal deviation. Body, the primary turbine housing prototypes failed catastrophically at 28,000 RPM. The harmonic vibration shattered our testing stand. 2 of our mechanical engineers were hospitalized with shrapnel injuries. The containment housing was destroyed. Another message arrived 3 seconds later. Subject, fraudulent architecture. Body, your schematics are fundamentally flawed. The tolerances do not match the physical stress loads. You sold us defective, dangerous blueprints. The escrow transfer is permanently canceled. Our contract is void, and then the final, devastating blow. Subject, immediate repayment demand. Body, we demand the immediate return of the $250,000 consulting retainer, transferred to your offshore account. If the funds are not routed back within 48 hours, our legal representation in the United States will contact federal authorities regarding international wire fraud and industrial sabotage. Do not ignore this communication. I slowly looked up from my monitor. Through the glass walls of my office, across the mezzanine, I had a direct line of sight into Donald's workspace. I watched the exact moment his world ended. Donald was staring at his computer screen. All the color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified stranger. His hands hovered over his keyboard, trembling violently. He typed a few letters, hit backspace, and typed again. He was trying to formulate a response, trying to explain that the files were perfect, that their testing methods must have been flawed, but he couldn't. He knew the reputation of the Shenzhen firm. They didn't make testing errors. When a man builds his entire identity on the illusion of control and unearned status, the moment he loses it isn't just frightening to him. It is physically devastating. I watched my son press the heels of his hands into his eyes, his chest heaving as panic suffocated him. His offshore exit strategy hadn't just failed, it had detonated in his face. He was in debt to a massive international conglomerate. His luxury payout was gone, and he was staring down the barrel of international wire fraud. He stood up, pacing the length of his office like a trapped animal. I watched the gears turning in his head. He was desperate. He was cornered, and cornered men do not surrender, they double down. I saw him stop pacing. He looked out through his glass wall, his eyes fixing on my office. I kept my face perfectly blank, holding a pen over an invoice. Donald turned rapidly to his heavy filing cabinet. He yanked the bottom drawer open and pulled out a stack of thick, glossy binders. They were the domestic buyout proposals, the hostile takeover documents. He didn't know the IP was ruined. He just thought the Shenzhen deal had collapsed due to a technical error. His only remaining play was to force the domestic sale immediately, using the fabricated Dementia narrative to trigger the emergency power of attorney. He needed to push me out and cash in his golden parachute from the domestic conglomerate before anyone realized he was drowning in liability. My desk phone vibrated. The caller ID flashed a private number. I picked up the receiver, keeping my eyes fixed on Donald's office. "Ward, it's Sarah," the voice on the other end said, the quiet professional blade. "I just received confirmation from my contact at the Bureau. The federal warrants for the server logs and his personal devices have been signed by a judge. The civil injunctions are sitting in my briefcase." "What is the timeline?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They do not want to execute the warrant at his home. They want him on site where the digital theft occurred," Sarah explained. She withheld the exact hour of the raid, giving me only the operational parameters I needed. "We have the green light, Tom. The trap is armed." "He's moving," I said, watching Donald practically tear his office apart. "The offshore deal collapsed. The parts shattered on the testing stand just like I engineered. He's panicking. He is pulling the domestic buyout binders right now." "He is going to try to force your hand before the weekend," Sarah stated clinically. "He wants to execute the medical incompetence clause." "He's going to ambush me," I confirmed. "Let him," Sarah replied. "Do not engage today. Do not tip him off. Let him walk into the boardroom tomorrow morning thinking he holds all the cards. I will see you there." The line clicked dead. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. Through the glass, Donald was moving with reckless, erratic energy. He was a man who had just watched his secret empire burn to the ground, trying to salvage the ashes before anyone smelled the smoke. He shoved the glossy binders into his expensive leather briefcase, his hands visibly shaking as he struggled with the brass clasps. He snatched his car keys off the desk, didn't bother to turn off his computer, and practically ran out of his office, descending the steel stairs to the shop floor without looking at a single machinist. I sat in my quiet office, the low hum of American manufacturing vibrating through the floorboards beneath my boots. The paper fortress was complete. Tomorrow morning, he was going to try to take my life's work. And tomorrow morning, he was going to find out exactly what happens when you mistake a quiet man for a weak one. The glass-walled conference room on the mezzanine had always been the quietest place in the building. It was soundproof to keep out the heavy, rhythmic thud of the machinery below, designed for negotiating supply contracts in peace. But at 8 o'clock on Friday morning, the silence inside that room felt entirely different. It felt pressurized, like a deep-water containment vessel moments before a structural breach. I sat at the head of the long oak table, my hands resting flat against the polished wood. My thermos of black coffee sat exactly where it always did. To my right sat Mike, my floor supervisor of 20 years. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his heavy, calloused hands fidgeting with a pen. He had been ordered to attend, though he didn't fully understand why. At exactly 6 minutes past the hour, the heavy glass door swung open. Donald walked in. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were two men in immaculate charcoal gray suits, carrying expensive leather briefcases. They were the corporate litigators from the downtown firm, the ones Donald had emailed days earlier to draft the emergency injunction. Donald looked completely different from the panicked, terrified man I had watched through the window yesterday afternoon. Overnight, he had rebuilt his mask. He was standing tall, projecting the calm, sorrowful authority of an executive forced to make a tragic but necessary decision. He took the seat directly across from me. Two lawyers sat on his left. Donald placed a stack of thick, glossy binders on the center of the table. Then he slid a single, stapled legal document toward me. "Dad," he started. His voice was pitched perfectly, a masterclass in manufactured empathy. "I want you to know that this is the hardest thing I have ever had to do, but I have to protect you, and I have to protect the 85 families who rely on this company to survive." I didn't touch the document. I kept my eyes locked on his. "Protect me from what, Donald?" He sighed, a heavy theatrical sound. He looked at Mike, silently asking for backup before turning back to me. "From yourself. The mistakes have been piling up. The delayed vendor authorizations, the forgotten financial projections, the erratic decision-making. We've all seen it. You are losing your grip on the operational reality of this business. The doctors call it early-onset cognitive decline." One of the litigators leaned forward, folding his hands. "Mr. Ward, my name is Robert Vance. We represent your son. What you have in front of you is a medical injunction and an emergency transfer of power of attorney. Given your recent documented lapses in memory and administrative competence, the board, acting through Donald, is removing you as primary shareholder, effective immediately." "It doesn't have to be ugly, Dad," Donald said quickly, leaning over the table. "I've secured the domestic buyout. The conglomerate is willing to honor the original multiple. They will acquire the company, protect the patents, and pay you a generous retirement package. You can step down with dignity. But if you fight this, we will be forced to present the affidavits of your incompetence in open court. Please, just sign the transition agreement." He pushed a silver pen across the oak table. It rolled to a stop against my coffee thermos. For 30 years, I had built a life on the principle of absolute, measurable truth. I had machined parts that had to withstand 20,000 pounds of atmospheric pressure, where a single invisible lie in the metal meant catastrophic failure. I looked at my son, listening to the flawless, calculated lie he had constructed to steal my life's work, and I felt nothing but a deep, Arctic calm. "You're right about one thing, Donald," I said. my voice barely above a whisper, stripped of every ounce of anger. The company is transitioning today. I didn't reach for his pen. I didn't look at the injunction. I simply reached into my jacket pocket and pressed a button on my phone. 10 seconds later, the glass door of the conference room opened again. Sarah Jenkins walked in. She was wearing a tailored navy suit, carrying nothing but a single, thick manila envelope. She didn't look at Donald. She didn't look at his attorneys. She walked straight to the table, pulled out the empty leather chair to my left, and sat down. Robert Vance, Donald's lead attorney, frowned. "Excuse me, this is a closed executive meeting. Who are you?" Sarah unclasped the manila envelope. She pulled out a stack of paper and placed it squarely in the middle of the table, right next to Donald's glossy binders. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice sharp and clinical. "I am the senior corporate counsel for Ward Precision Aerospace. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, you are sitting in a room with a man who no longer possesses any legal authority, employment status, or physical access rights to this facility." Donald scoffed, a short, nervous sound. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dad. You're hiring outside counsel without board approval. It just proves the paranoia." Sarah didn't even blink. She slid the first document across the table to Robert Vance. "Mr. Vance," Sarah said, addressing the lawyer directly, "before you continue to advocate for your client, I suggest you review the timestamp on that document. It is a certified federal keystroke log, recorded beneath the operating system of your client's workstation. It details the unauthorized extraction of 4.2 gigabytes of proprietary, patent-pending aerospace schematics, executed at 2:14 a.m. on Saturday." Vance stopped. The condescending posture vanished entirely. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the lines of code and the unassailable timestamps. Sarah slid a second piece of paper across the table. "That is the intercepted, encrypted email your client sent exactly 12 minutes later. It confirms the successful transfer of those stolen schematics to a foreign corporate holding group based in Shenzhen, China. It also explicitly demands the release of a $250,000 escrow retainer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Below us, the faint, heavy thud of the CNC machines continued, a heartbeat of American industry completely indifferent to the destruction happening in the room above it. Donald's face had lost all its color. The confident, arrogant executive was gone, replaced instantly by the terrified, cornered kid I had watched through the glass the day before. "This is fake," Donald stammered, his voice cracking. "Dad, this is a paranoid delusion. She fabricated this." "I assure you, Donald, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Corporate Espionage Division does not fabricate network traffic," Sarah replied evenly. "By transmitting domestic aerospace patents to a foreign entity, you didn't just breach your fiduciary duty. You violated the Economic Espionage Act of 1996. You committed international wire fraud." Robert Vance dropped the paper onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. In corporate litigation, lawyers are paid to navigate gray areas. But there is no gray area in federal espionage. Vance realized instantly that Donald had used his firm to attempt a fraudulent takeover while actively covering up a federal crime. Vance stood up. He didn't look at Donald. He looked directly at Sarah. "Counselor," Vance said, his voice tight and completely professional. "My firm was retained strictly for domestic succession planning. We were entirely unaware of any intellectual property theft or offshore communications. We are withdrawing our representation of Mr. Ward immediately." "Wait," Donald panicked, reaching out toward the lawyer. "Robert, you can't just leave. We have a contract." "Do not contact my office again, Mr. Ward," Vance said. He and his associate grabbed their briefcases and walked out the door without looking back. The sudden absence of his legal shield left Donald completely exposed. He was sitting alone on his side of the long oak table, staring at the forensic dossier that had just dismantled his entire reality. "You planned this," Donald whispered, his eyes darting from the documents to me. The realization was finally dawning on him. The domestic buyout wasn't his masterstroke, it was his desperate final gasp. "You knew the Shenzhen deal collapsed. You knew they rejected the files." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "They didn't just reject the files, Donald," I said, my voice calm, steady, and unyielding. "The files failed. When you bypassed my authority to broker a backroom deal with our competitors, you assumed you were the smartest person in the room. You assumed my analog methodology was outdated." I tapped the surface of the table with my index finger. "But I am the one who built the master architecture. Before you stole those schematics, I altered the digital checksums. I shaved a fraction of a millimeter off the internal bracing parameters. You didn't sell them a working prototype. You sold them a catastrophic structural failure. And when they spun those components up to 28,000 revolutions per minute on their testing stands yesterday afternoon, the metal tore itself apart. You destroyed your own reputation with the only people who were willing to pay you. Donald stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the sheer magnitude of the trap finally making sense. He hadn't just been caught, he had been permitted to execute his own destruction. I had handed him the rope, and he had tied the knot with absolute precision. "You poisoned the data," he breathed, looking at me as if I were a stranger. "I protected my company," I corrected quietly, "and I protected the 85 people downstairs who actually work for a living." Sarah Jenkins checked the gold watch on her left wrist. "The domestic buyout you attempted to force today is dead," Sarah stated, delivering the final clinical blows. "The medical injunction is entirely fraudulent. We have already filed a civil suit against you for breach of fiduciary duty, corporate sabotage, and defamation. Every single bank account, stock portfolio, and piece of property attached to your name was frozen by a state judge at 7:30 this morning." "You're taking everything," Donald said, his voice hollow, the panic giving way to a sickening realization of total ruin. "Dad, you're leaving me with nothing. The Shenzhen Group, they are demanding the $250,000 retainer back. If I don't have the assets to repay them, they'll destroy me." I looked at him. I remembered the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. I remembered the college tuition I had worked double shifts to pay for, and I remembered the sound of his voice in the supervisor's office, casually assassinating my character to steal my life. The emotional margin was gone. "You made a business decision, Donald," I said quietly. "Now you have to pay the invoice." Before Donald could respond, the deep hum of the shop floor outside the glass walls suddenly shifted. The sound of a heavy diesel engine echoed through the building as the main loading bay doors were rolled open. I looked through the glass. Down at the factory floor, 2 dark SUVs had pulled directly into the shipping lane, bypassing the delivery trucks. 6 men wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back stepped out onto the concrete. Mike, the floor supervisor, stood up from the table. He had been silent the entire meeting, his face a mask of shock as he listened to the truth about the man he had almost trusted. He looked at Donald with pure, unadulterated disgust. "I'll go let them up," Mike said gruffly. He turned and walked out of the conference room. Donald watched the federal agents moving toward the steel stairs. His breathing became rapid, shallow. The luxury lifestyle, the corporate status, the arrogant belief that he was untouchable, it all evaporated in the span of 15 minutes. He was a man without a lawyer, without a company, and without a father, waiting for the handcuffs to click around his wrists. I didn't stay to watch the arrest. I didn't need to see him marched out in front of the employees he had tried to sell out. I stood up, picked up my thermos of black coffee, and nodded respectfully to Sarah Jenkins. I walked out of the glass-walled conference room by the side door, leaving him sitting alone with the paper fortress that had buried him. The fallout was meticulous, comprehensive, and entirely documented. It played out over the next 6 months with the slow, inevitable grinding of the legal system. Donald was indicted on 3 federal counts of economic espionage and international wire fraud. Because I had preserved the uncorrupted master files on the offline drive, the company didn't lose a single day of production. Ward Precision Aerospace maintained its contracts, its workforce, and its integrity. The civil injunction Sarah had filed stripped Donald of his remaining equity, and the ruin that followed was absolute. Because the federal government had frozen his accounts, he couldn't repay the offshore holding company. The Shenzhen conglomerate sued him in international court, liquidating whatever assets the federal authorities didn't seize. His leased luxury sedan was repossessed from the company parking lot the very afternoon he was arrested. His downtown condo went into foreclosure. He had traded genuine family loyalty for the illusion of corporate status, and when the illusion shattered, there was absolutely nothing underneath to catch him. As for me, I went back to the only life I had ever wanted. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and bright, 6 months after the boardroom doors had closed on my son. I was standing on the shop floor. The air smelled strongly of hot machine oil, raw aluminum, and industrial cutting fluid. It was a loud, chaotic, beautiful symphony. I walked over to the primary CNC machine. The heavy iron door slid open, revealing a newly finished aerospace component. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the solid steel micrometer, the metal smooth and worn against my thumb. I locked the tool around the aluminum strut, checking the tolerances. It was perfect, down to the 1,000th of an inch. A clean, undeniable fact. There were no hidden motives in the metal, no manipulation, no lies. When you measure something with absolute precision, the truth always reveals itself. I wiped the tool clean, placed it back in my pocket, and took a sip of black coffee. The shop floor hummed around me, strong and steady, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt nothing but a quiet, unshakable peace.